today. My name is Kevin Wilson, and this is The Beacon. Thanks so much for tuning in. This is Dominion Payroll's ongoing webinar series where we bring you insights and perspectives from around the small business community. We look at industry spotlights and we look at topics that are relevant to the challenges of running a business in today's environment. We're here every Wednesday at 11 a.m. for you, and I'm really excited to have this super important and topical conversation today. Before I introduce our esteemed guest, a couple housekeeping measures. If you do have any questions for our guest today, I encourage you to drop those in the Q&A function. I will do my best to work those into the conversation, as organically as possible. I do ask that you avoid the chat. We record these so that folks can view them later, and the Q&A plays nicely with that while the chat disappears at the end of the show. If you're interested in registering for any of our future webinars, I encourage you to go to dominionpayroll.com and hit that COVID-19 resource button at the top of the homepage. There you can find a list of all of our upcoming webinars, previously recorded ones, and a whole host of forms to help you navigate the CARES Act, FFCRA, ERC, the entirety of the alphabet soup that we've grown to know and love. We are there for you with all those resources, and we are always there for you at questions@dominionpayroll.com. If you've got that burning question that keeps you up at 3 o'clock in the morning, shoot us a note and we will do our best to get you the comfort you need and the resources and information you need to navigate today's frankly challenging business environment. All right, that is enough about how you can get in touch with us, stay in touch with us, but I do encourage you to do so. I want to jump into today's topic. Today, we're going to be looking at mental health in the workforce. And that is a growing topic of concern for everybody that's involved in the management of people, the running of organizations. And it really exists out there in the world on a spectrum from how do you manage people who are just having an off day to the full extent of the legalese in the American Disabilities Act, and everything that exists in between. So anybody out there that is trying to successfully manage their people and run a successful organization and tend to the culture of their environment, this is something that increasingly has been brought to bear on the conversation. And over the last 11 and 12 months, it's certainly been at the forefront of a lot of people's minds. So without further ado, I'm really excited to welcome my colleague, Dr. Shayna Cooke. She is the Vice President of Human Capital at Dominion Payroll. I would just say a complete pleasure to work with. Shayna, thanks so much for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Kevin. I appreciate that. I'm looking forward to this conversation today.
Absolutely. Next up, we have Rachel Loria from the Disability Rights, she is a disability rights advocate at the Disability Law Center of Virginia, an organization that does fantastic work. We've been involved with some of the making sure that people have access to voting booths in the community. That is just a small sliver of the work that the DLCV does. And Rachel, it really brings a lot of expertise to the conversation today around the Americans with Disabilities Act. Rachel, I appreciate you being so giving with your time today.
Thanks so much for having me.
And I will just say that Rachel's colleague, Laura Sinclair, is on the call, and she is also with the Disability Law Center of Virginia. Primarily, our conversation is going to be with Rachel and Shayna and I, but should Laura want to jump in, she'll pop her camera on and contribute there. Laura, I appreciate you being here as well.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. Guys, I think this is such an important conversation, and one that, in some sense, it feels like it is sort of the topic du jour, and sometimes it feels like maybe it doesn't get enough attention. And I think that shining a light on it is a really important thing that we can do today for everybody in the audience that's out there figuring out how to best serve the people that they employ and make sure that they are doing the best job of being, responsible employers and places that people do want to work. Rachel, I'd like to ask you to just sort of kick us off and tell us a little bit about your role as a disability rights advocate, and tell us a little bit about the DLCV.
Sure. My name is Rachel Loria. I'm a disability rights advocate at the Disability Law Center of Virginia. I've been working there for about 7 years. I work primarily on the vocational rehabilitation end, and also I do some work in assistive technology and some work in pre-employment transition services, focusing on getting high school students services necessary to transition out of high school, specifically vocationally. First of all, can you hear me okay?
Yeah, coming through loud and
Okay,
clear.
great. Just making sure. You can't trust technology all the time here. So DLCV is the Protection and Advocacy Office throughout the Commonwealth for people with disabilities. We were established in 1975. Congress mandated that every single state in the US and territory have a protection and advocacy agency for people with disabilities to make sure that people with disabilities were treated fairly and they weren't discriminated against. Previously, a lot of people with disabilities were put into institutions or segregated from the community, and the protection and advocacy offices really worked to limit that. So we were formerly a lot of different names, but the latest one that we had was Virginia Office for Protection and Advocacy, VOPA. We became Disability Law Center of Virginia on October 1st, 2013. We work in a lot of ways in our office to help individuals who have disabilities throughout the state of Virginia. That's one of the most common questions we get. It's, do you guys just work in Richmond or do you work throughout the state? We work throughout the state. If we have a client in the southwest area of the state, we will travel to that client, just like if we have a client in Tidewater. So we work to do a lot of different things. We work to make sure people are not abused or neglected in state hospitals. We work to provide advocacy and guidance to parents of children with disabilities to make sure children receive a free and appropriate public education that they deserve. We work to advocate for that places in the community are accessible, like you had mentioned, the voting booths. We do a lot of work to make sure people with disabilities have access to curbside voting or have access to vote in an equitable and fair way. And we also do some work in answering questions and providing guidance to people who have questions about supplemental security income, SSI or SSDI. And finally, we work to make sure that people with disabilities receive the appropriate supports from vocational rehabilitation agencies so that they can work and have assistance working if they want to work. So we do a wide range of different things at the LCV.
That's great. I mean, a tremendous number of services come under that umbrella,
Right.
and critically important. I'm eager. I'm glad that you're able to shine a spotlight on the organization and all the good work. I think that it's going to be really illuminating for our audience to learn how mental health and issues associated with that sort of tie in to this work around disability advocacy. Before we do jump into that conversation, though, Shayna, I'd love to turn to you. You've been with Dominion Payroll now approaching a year. Is that right?
Almost, Kevin.
Almost there.
Almost. Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about your journey. You know, I know that you come out of the education space, but then I'd love to sort of hear about your ethos or the way that you look out across managing multiple offices, lots of different people. What kind of perspective do you bring to that line of work?
Yeah. So thanks again for having me. I have had a very non-linear career, right? So I spent the very first part of my career in education. I was a classroom teacher for 17 years across from middle school all the way up through community college level. And then after I basically had both of my children and they were kind of in the world and doing their things, I went back and got my doctorate in leadership and administration. And during that time, I transitioned out of schools and into a consulting role for educators. And so I was doing a lot of work with schools around the world, basically on culture development, a lot of work with administrations of schools who maybe were experiencing a toxic faculty culture and ways to navigate that, or working with faculty on how to create more enriching and engaging lessons for students in the classroom. And so, when I first came into Dominion, or at least even anticipated leaving education and moving more towards the business sector, I think like a lot of educators, I was like, I'm not sure if I have the skills that translate into that. But for me now, knowing what I know a year into the role, there is such a seamless transition between schools and especially human resources, because either area you're developing people, right? And so like that's basically what I do at Dominion. I'm charged with developing people and nurturing culture, and that is across all 6 offices that we have, 6 branch offices. And so, I think it is a big job. There's a lot of different cultures and people and development that needs to happen in very unique ways, but I love it, and I love working with people on a daily basis, and I love trying to remove obstacles for people so that they can do their very best work, which I think is primarily what I do on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and I think that's it's a really good jumping off point for sort of exploring this idea that your role in terms of HR and advocacy, as you look out across the entire organization, you're like, hey, I've got middle managers, I've got entry level folks, I've got people who are beginning of their career, folks that are close to retirement. I mean, there's a huge variety of folks that you are charged with making sure are able to do their job productively, but also sort of feel good about doing their job.
Right.
And I think as you look across that huge diversity of lived experiences, mental health is a component there, where everybody has had a different journey. Whether that, and as I alluded to sort of in the intro, that spectrum of experience from, frankly, having a crappy day, all the way through to having a diagnosis.
Right.
And your role, you do have to deal with that. And so I'd like to ask you, in talking about company culture, how does a focus on mental health in the workplace, what's the right place for that component of a company culture? When you're thinking about developing this whole stew, right? Mental health is a part of that. And how do you think about that when you're interacting with people from the hiring process to through the working day?
Yeah, I mean, I think, businesses have evolved significantly over the past couple decades. Prior to now, I think it was like, come in, do your job, don't share too much, go home. You know what I mean? Really kind of keep your work, your personal and your professional separate. And I think that there is a movement, thankfully, where we really want people to be able to bring their whole selves to work. And for people to bring their whole selves to work, we have to acknowledge that that's not always going to be pretty. It's not always going to be happy. But there has to be a space for people to be who they are, and then also to share what they need to share when they need to share it. And I would say, we intentionally do a number of different things to make sure that we are asking people to focus on their mental health. But I would say the most important thing that you can do, especially from an HR perspective, is to build relationships with people so that they feel like they have a space to go. So, for instance, my very first thing that I did when I came on board was to have an individual conversation with every employee that we have. And it takes time, right? Like each one was about 15 minutes and we have 135 employees. But to me, it's really important to take the time and have the conversation, to get to know you a little bit better, to understand where you're coming from, but then also for you to not be like, oh, that scary HR lady sitting up in Richmond, but to be like, oh, I need to talk to Shayna about this because I'm struggling right now. And I think the work that I put in the front end is really paying off now, because I would say that I've had more and more conversations with employees lately around these things, around this idea of mental health and burnout and dissatisfaction and everything that I think is coming forward from COVID, from the remote nature of work. And so I think building those relationships is the most important thing to do, to make sure that you are creating a relationship where people feel like it's a two-way street, and that HR is no longer just those people that deal with our paychecks, but like HR is a place where you can come and say, you know what, this is not working for me and I need something different, and to really be heard in those moments.
Yeah, creating,
like you were nodding your head in agreement at a lot of
creating that community of communication is really, really important. Making sure that people feel comfortable talking about vulnerability and talking about things that they might not be completely confident about talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. Rachel, I know that on the Americans with Disabilities Act is sort of the legal framework for dealing with issues of mental health in the workplace. It is the most formal of the processes. I'm hoping you could give us a little bit of background on what the ADA did, from the outset.
Sure.
And I know that we've recently celebrated, I believe it's 50-year anniversary of the ADA. And so, I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the history and then maybe illuminate us on how it pertains to mental health.
Sure. So the Americans with Disabilities Act was signed on July 26, 1990 by President George Bush, H.W. Bush. So Titles 1 and 3 in the Americans with Disabilities Act are the ones that talk about reasonable. Titles 1 through 3 are the ones that talk about how people with disabilities should receive reasonable accommodations, and that can absolutely relate to people who have mental health disabilities in the workplace, and also not just in the workplace, but in the community. If they're going into a government building or they're going into a restaurant, they're still required to have reasonable accommodations. So that's really important to remember. It's also important that, excuse me, with these documents, people with disabilities are also given more information about how to file a complaint if they feel like they're being discriminated against. Part of the ADA also limits being treated differently because you associate with people with disabilities. If you have a family member that has a disability, part of the ADA limits discrimination on that as well, which is kind of sad that we have to have a law that makes it so that you can't discriminate against people. So today we're primarily going to focus on Title 1, but it is important to remember that Titles 1 through 3 do entitle people with disabilities to reasonable accommodation, and that includes people with mental health challenges.
I think that may sort of come as news to some folks, as they, I think that I was guilty, thinking that a disability in my head is often visible.
Right.
And mental health, it lives on
Not
the
always visible. Yeah. And that's a challenge often. We'll talk about disclosure in a couple of minutes, and that's often a challenge because people think that because they have a disability, it's something that has to be seen. And often there are these invisible disabilities that are difficult to see.
Absolutely. Shayna, I'd like to ask you in terms of approaching mental health in the workplace. I think as employers try to bring in, a diverse talent pool, highly qualified people, broadly speaking, are you seeing an increased emphasis on mental health in the workplace, from candidates that are applying to work at Dominion Payroll, and then sort of in the wider space, that conversation, is that becoming more prevalent around, both acceptance and everything from that sort of the reasonable accommodation is required by the law, but also sort of that cultural component of creating places that are welcoming to all and all different abilities. What is your take on that?
I mean, I would say that I don't necessarily see more of a focus during the recruiting process for that, but I do see it in the retention piece, right? So we want our employees to stay at Dominion. In order for them to stay, they need to feel like they belong, that they're heard, and that they are valued there. And part of that comes along with appreciating them all the time, not just when they're able to bust out all the work and the productivity, but appreciating them and supporting them when they are struggling and providing resources for them during that struggle. And so I think for us, part of our big push for that employee satisfaction is how do we support them? So we at Dominion, we have a very rich EAP, which is an employee assistance program. And that's basically a relationship with our healthcare, where employees can reach out and get kind of support in whatever they need. It might be financial literacy, it could be like in creating a will, it might be around wellness, but there's also a huge component around mental health, and access to therapists and counselors to create relationships. So I do a lot of talking with employees about that. Do you know that we have this? It's really easy to use. Let me show you. We also try to live our values, and one of our values is balance, and creating a work-life balance. And if you want people to stay around for a long time, then you need to create a space for them that involves a work-life balance, right? Not get the very most that you can out of them and have them leave in 2 years. I mean, we know that a lot of times when people leave, it's a lateral move. So it's not necessarily they're leaving for more money, they're leaving for a different value. Maybe it is balance. And so for us, we really push, take your breaks during the day, take your lunchtime, especially right now, while everybody is remote, right? So like you might wake up, walk 2 steps to your computer, work for 8 hours, walk 3 steps to the couch, and you're just kind of living in this Groundhog Day. And so we really talk to employees about, take your 15 minutes, go for a walk with your dog in the middle of the day. If you need to run an errand at lunch, run an errand at lunch. Like, live your life and your work, but make sure that it's not all about work all the time. And then we also really ask for people to take their paid time off or their PTO. One of our office managers at our office in Texas is really good about almost requiring that her team takes a week basically in the spring, and then a week basically at the end of winter after year end. She really wants them to take their full time and encourages and schedules that. And so I think, yes, we want people to be all in with their work, but yes, we also want them to recognize that you can't do that forever. And so where is that balance? And take the time that you need. The work will never stop. You'll never catch up. You'll never get everything off your to-do list. And so if you don't prioritize your mental health, you don't prioritize your time for yourself, then all you're going to do is be burning the candle at both ends and never feeling like you're fully present anywhere. And that you're, maybe not even doing a great job as a mom or as a employee, or like whatever your different roles and different hats that you wear, because you're just grinding all day.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that's such a critical consideration. And it's the idea that you can maybe be good at one thing, but you can't be good at all things.
Right.
Nobody has that capacity. And I think that, across organizations that, are recognized for their welcoming culture, the ones that are growing, this emphasis on work-life balance, people taking the time, being deliberate about it, not just saying, hey, this, we have 13 days of PTO, and then never talking about it again. That intentional communication, I think, is really critical, especially for anybody in our audience that's thinking about, this has been an incredibly challenging year. How do I take that first step towards talking to my employees, making sure that they feel seen? Because it can feel like simultaneously ambiguous. Like, yes, we want to support mental health in the workplace, but what's like an actionable thing that we can do here?
That's right. Well, and I would say, some of the work that we do as well as with the management team, and this, Kevin, we're trying to be more intentional about how are you communicating with employees outside of working hours. Don't send an email at 9 p.m. because even though we try to say, don't worry about responding, the employee is going to feel guilt about not responding, pressure about not responding, and one of the things that we said in our last manager meeting was, if you wouldn't physically get in the car and drive this note to your employee's house, if it's not that important, then don't send the email after hours, right? And use the tools that you have. The send later tool on Microsoft is great. So like, let's say I have to get things off my list. I don't need to send it right now. I can send later and have it go during normal working hours. And so really being respectful about that work-life balance with your employees. We already take a lot of time, during the day. And when you are reaching out to them after hours, you are now invading their family time, or you are invading their social time, or you're even invading their personal time. And they give so much during the day. I don't think it's too much to ask for us to give them that time in the evenings and the weekends.
I will have to ask that you stop knocking on my door at 9 p.m. just to hand me these notes.
I'm just kidding. I'm totally kidding.
Rachel, I want to turn to you because there's an aspect of the
Right.
ADA that I think is we hear it a lot, reasonable accommodation. And that can sound simultaneously like, oh yeah, sure, reasonable accommodation, but I know that there's a legal framework there, and there's
Mhm.
also the ADA makes allowances for essential job roles.
Essential functions of the job. Yep.
Yeah, and so I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about what do reasonable accommodations look like in terms of sort of the letter of the law, but also best practices. I mean, there's
Sure.
some wiggle room in there, I believe.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So let's like start by defining, according to the law, what reasonable accommodation actually is. It's any kind of modification or adjustment to a job or the work environment that might make a person who has a disability able to participate more either in the application process or to perform essential functions of the job. So essential functions of the job are defined as any basic tasks that are necessary to get the job done. So what's important to understand is that if an employee needs an accommodation to do that task, they are entitled to that reasonable accommodation under Title I of the ADA. But it's also important, just from a communication standpoint, to talk with the employer about what tasks are actually essential and what accommodations are available on the job to meet those essential functions of the job. Let's look at an example here. So if a person is a stalker and they're stalking shelves at a store and they need a visual reminder of what goes on each shelf, is this an accommodation that the employer could provide? If this is not considered reasonable, it's important to have that conversation and say, okay, that might not be reasonable, but here are some other alternatives that might fill the same purpose. It's also important to think about the fact that the vocational rehabilitation agencies, Department for Aging and Rehabilitative Services, and the Department for the Blind and Vision Impaired. If that employee is a client that has an open case with those agencies, they may be able to provide a job coach that could come in and support that employee until they've learned the essential functions of the job. So it's really important to remember not just the letter of the law, but to have that communication with the employee, because maybe the employer thinks of an accommodation that might fulfill the accommodation that the employer hasn't thought about. So it's really important to just keep an open mind and start thinking, like, make it a dialogue instead of a one-way conversation.
For sure. Yeah, I think that's a really good sort of call to action in terms of folks out there.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that it bleeds into a topic that we've discussed several times here on the Beacon, where there's the letter of the law. There's also, I would really hope that there's a desire to be a good employer out there,
Absolutely.
to employ the best people and to have them want to stick around. And I think that some of these best practices, they have knock-on effects that improve everybody's experience within the workforce.
And there's an idea that the person is still a person when they exit the job at the end of the day. There's still, that person doesn't stop. Their life continues.
Sure.
So their life also continues before they enter the workplace in the morning. So it's important to, even from an employer's perspective, to understand that those types of things may play a role in the job performance, and to have that honest conversation and create a community that conversation is respected and confidential.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
I'd like to open this question up to the two of you. I think it may be difficult for some employers, sort of going back to that idea of visible versus invisible disabilities. And I I can empathize a little bit with someone feeling like frustrated as an employer out there, and just like, I'm just trying to get people in the door to do this job, and now I have to be accommodating of something that I can't smell, taste, or touch. And so I'm wondering if you could walk me through a little bit, examples of some mental health disabilities, and the accommodations that employers can make. And Rachel, I think if I could start with you,
Sure.
and then Shayna, I'll sort of pose the same question to you afterwards.
Sure.
So there's lots of examples of mental health disabilities. I think we're all kind of familiar with the anxiety and the depression. Examples of reasonable accommodations could be like asking for noise reducing headphones so that a person can focus more when they're working, so that they're not distracted as much, for focus. Asking for more breaks during the day so that they can sort through their thoughts, or be able to separate from work at certain times during the day. Asking for a quiet place to work. Those are all reasonable accommodations. And there's accommodations that I might not have listed there that you can talk with your employer about. As far as documentation, do you want me to go into a little bit of the documentation?
Sure. Yeah, I think it'd be helpful.
Sure.
Anybody out there that's employing people, and having
Absolutely.
that file, this is important to know.
As far as documentation goes, that can really vary. So a doctor's note can sometimes help, but it's not always required. So like I said, keep that community of communication going. And other ways to request accommodations could just be talking with your manager or with the HR department about accommodations that might help you and why they might help. This is the situation that's going on. This is what might help me. This is why it might help. This is what's going to happen if I don't get that accommodation. So think outside the box, like we've already talked about. Sometimes you might not get exactly what you're requesting, but you might get something similar that could work just as well. And if you don't know of accommodations that might help you, there's lots of resources out there like the Job Accommodation Network, JAN, that could help to provide some ideas on accommodations. Or if you're a client of VR, they could also help you advocate for accommodations on the job.
I think that's really interesting. When I think of the ADA, I sort of think of compliance things like how wide a door needs to be.
Right. And that's part of it, but that's not the whole thing.
Right. And I think that when we talk about mental health, there's a little bit, it's less prescribed in necessarily the architecture of a building. And Shayna, just sort of the creativity that goes into some of these accommodations. I'm curious if you could sort of talk about, from an HR perspective, if you were talking to a counterpart in another company, how would you advise folks to approach these accommodations? And what is your best take on dealing with employees that are dealing with these sort of unseen disabilities?
Yeah, I think what's interesting is for a long time, mental health has gone undiagnosed, right? And so a lot of people, in our age group, for instance, may have struggled their entire lives with something, but have never been diagnosed with that. And so I think just getting to a space where we're allowed to have a conversation about this, where people are allowed to say, you know what, I'm feeling depressed, or I'm feeling and I'm just dissatisfied. A lot of times that's just a kind of a continual lifelong thing that they've had to deal with. And so having, again, those open lines of communication with employees, and actually really just reaching out and saying, hey, you know what, we haven't talked in a while. How are things? Anything I can do to help you? And I find with that, a lot of times people aren't necessarily in the space where they're like, I have a diagnosis of anxiety and here's what's going to help me with that. But they might say to you that they're having emotions or feelings that we know are, contribute to anxiety, but they might know that. And so just having open lines of communication asking how you can help, anything you can take off their plates, anything that's weighing on them heavily, I think is a good way to start with that. And I mean, I realize that some people probably listening to this have hundreds of employees, which is a challenge, but I'm assuming with hundreds of employees would come a more robust HR department. So making sure that you're splitting that load and reaching out and creating those the lines of communication. And then I would also say, obviously it kind of goes without saying, especially in the HR department, but reserving judgment of folks when they come in, and as the HR person showing up to the conversation curious, meaning that's interesting, Kevin, that you say that. I hadn't thought about that before. Tell me more about that, instead of being like, oh, this guy's just trying to get out of, work or whatever. You showing up in a space where you're like, okay, this is something that's really impacting him. How can I help Kevin? And really looking at your employees as individuals, I think would be a great way to start with that. And a lot of, you probably know in a lot of schools, there's these things called IEPs, which are individual like education plans or learning plans for students. And they're not perfect, but wouldn't it be awesome if we got an employee that came with their like individual self plan that said, here's what I need to be my best self. And for me to say that is awesome. We can get you those headphones, or we can get you a corner desk / office because you need it quiet. Like if people knew themselves well enough to say, here's what I need to do my best work. And for HR to say, awesome, we can do that for you. I think that would be just the perfect blend between, really hearing people and then valuing them as well.
Yeah.
And I think Laura has something to add on this one too, right, Laura?
Yes, thank you. We are talking about, Rachel had opened up the floor to answer some questions about working with people who have invisible disabilities. And I think I have an extensive background in working in vocational coaching and negotiating accommodations in the workplace. And oftentimes there could be behaviors that show up that might seem like some sort of dropping the ball on responsibilities, when in reality it's a disability presenting itself. And maybe the employee knows what they need and they can come to you. And I would encourage trusting that employee. Again, that's not used as a way of shirking work or getting out of work, but it's something that they've already identified as a solution. For example, if someone has PTSD, they might want a desk that faces the door, so that they don't feel like someone could come behind them. That's an easy and free accommodation that if someone seems nervous, you could ask them, would you feel more comfortable with these types of things, or brainstorm together. I remember I worked with a client who had a really hard time rotating through tasks. His job was to kind of check on all sorts of different things in a grocery store, really struggled with that. So the solution was to turn his phone on vibrate to go off in his pocket every 5 minutes. So it would prompt him as a reminder to kind of go check something out. And that was something that was free, discreet. It wasn't interruptive. It was an effective solution. It wasn't something that he had thought of on his own, not the employer on their own, but brainstorming together, looking at what the problem was, was discovered that it wasn't that person not doing their job so much as needing that accommodation. I worked with another client who was spending a lot of time off duty on the clock in the restroom, and a lot of other employees in that business had been fired for kind of hiding out, not doing their job and taking extensive breaks. So that was brought to my attention, and it turned out that he was suffering from some disability related physical issues and didn't have money to pay for his healthcare. So again, it wasn't him trying to avoid work so much as experiencing these physical effects. So I, really, all of those situations where employees feeling comfortable enough to disclose what was really going on instead of feeling shame or stigma, or really the biggest worry is, am I going to lose my job if I tell you that this is what's happening and it's because of a disability? The challenge of disclosing that. So this discussion is great to hear different opinions and some information both from my colleague Rachel and from you all about how you work to do that. But trusting employees to tell you what they know has worked for them has been the most important key to success in my experience.
A really good insight there.
They're the expert, and it's important to realize that they're the expert on themselves.
Yeah. I thank you for that, Laura. I appreciate that insight. Much of this conversation has been sort of employer focused, and I'd like to turn a little bit to sort of that employee piece. And Rachel, if you could tell us, in terms of disclosure, I mean, it's a very sensitive topic, in terms of
Absolutely.
what you reveal to your employer and how you will be judged there. What is an employee required to disclose, or how, and really sort of how much? What does that practically look
Right.
like?
So an employee is not required to disclose, like, if it should never be asked on like a job application. If you have a disability, they are legally not required to disclose. However, that kind of brings you to a little bit of a catch-22, because they're not required to disclose, but if they need accommodations, the employer's got to know why the employee needs those accommodations, most likely. And I say most likely because that's not always the case, but in many situations, if an employee needs an accommodation, the employer is going to want to know why. So there are some pros and some cons of disclosure. A pro is that the employer might be able to understand the person's strengths and their limitations a little bit better. And that is definitely a pro. I would definitely, if a person has to have this kind of conversation with their employer, lead with your strengths, lead with things that you do well, and things that you're succeeding in, and then focus on the things that you might need a little bit of help with. So the employer likewise might know after disclosure how to work better with that individual, how to make them more effective at their job, and also more comfortable at their job. Because it's not just about efficiency, it's about the employee as a whole and the agency as a whole. So some negative things might be that the person might start being treated differently. They might not be hired because of a disability if they choose to disclose. And there are mechanisms to report that if an employee does feel like they're being treated differently due to disclosure or due to having a disability. They can absolutely send a complaint to the Equal Employment Opportunities Commission, the EEOC, to try to get that situation resolved.
Yeah. Well, hopefully that's not something that
it's not. It's never a fun process.
Yeah. Shayna, I'd like to stick on sort of that the employee perspective of things, and I'm gonna fold in a question from Andy Sanders in the audience here. Employees, clearly they benefit from being able to bring their entire self to work and to to feel like their values align with an organization. How can what are some ideas around proactively trying to help employees? I mean, whether that is just a quarterly email that says, hey, take your PTO. Any ideas that almost programmatically that employers could roll out to really meet their employees where they are. In terms of mental health, I mean, I think that there's a benefit on that productivity bottom line, being proactive on it, but it's really convenient that it aligns with it being the right thing to do, right?
Yeah. I mean, I would say ask them. Frankly, it goes back to having that communication with them. What do they need? We can put forth all kinds of programs that we hope will, address those needs. But if we don't actually know what they need, then it might all be for naught. So I would say ask them, have open lines of communication, schedule those individual interviews with your employees quarterly or whatever. Work with the management team, making sure they're checking in all of the time with their employees on how they're doing. Not necessarily from a productivity standpoint, but from a mental health standpoint and from an employee engagement standpoint. Again, encouraging the PTO, encouraging them to use their time throughout the day, their breaks and their lunch to get outside, to get some fresh air, to just get away from the computer screen, to get away from their work, to encourage them to take some time away and give them that space, right? Like, don't tell them that you really want them to take the time, but then you just keep, hounding on productivity and backlogs and things along those lines. Like, make the actions align with the words that you use with employees. And then also, maybe that looks like a reward schedule. Imagine if we had like a way to reward employees for taking their time, for prioritizing their health, for taking all of their PTO in a year. We're giving it to them. We really intentionally, aside from this year, we did roll over all PTO that wasn't taken because most people weren't traveling, but primarily we only allow a little bit to roll over because honestly, we want people to step away to go recharge and then to be able to come back ready and fresh and to look at the year with fresh eyes. And so just considering what kind of space your employees might need and providing an opportunity for them to take that.
I would add to that and to folks that are considering this within their own workplaces is, be creative. I mean, there are absolutely some things that are going to sort of be maybe more common across all workplaces, time away, making reasonable accommodations towards sound and light and things like that. But if you want to be proactive, think about ways, the benefits of having an engaged workforce are huge.
Mm-hmm.
And it doesn't have to necessarily be around thinking of anything necessarily as a disability, but as, hey, if on Thursday afternoons we have a 15-minute mindfulness session,
Mm-hmm.
As an example of something that we've implemented around Dominion Payroll occasionally, that's a great way to just let people blow off a little steam and transition in the end of their day into, into heading home and their work, their family life. I would really encourage, think about ways that you can just fully see your employees and give them, these little opportunities to be their whole self,
Right. I mean, I think there are things, like last month we did a mindfulness session with our employee base, and we did one 30-minute session a week for all 4 weeks, and Grace Gallagher led that for us. You could look at some, providing apps for some of your employees. Like Headspace is a great mindfulness app, and it's a little bit expensive for some people, and so being able to provide that for them to sort of reimburse or comp that expense, I think would be a good idea. And also, we are getting ready to come back into the office in April, but we will keep our 1 day a week remote allowance for people. And there is something great about having that balance between in office and home, and allowing people to take a day when they want to still work, but they want to work from home, where like maybe the pace is different, or they can get more done, or maybe they just want to say, heaven forbid, in their comfy clothes for the day and kind of bust out their work. Allowing for that flexibility, again, for people to know what they need, and then allowing them to take what they need when they need it is a huge mental relief for folks.
Even just a walking group, like arranging for a time when employees can get out and take a walk during the day together. That was something that we had talked about last year at our office, that employees seem to enjoy and also seem to be kind of a stress relief. Laura, did you want to add in?
I do. One thing I think can also be helpful is to ask if there's an employee who does disclose an invisible disability to you, something related to mental health, or a diagnosed invisible disability that could be physical as well. And there can be mental health stress created because you have an invisible disability. So I know that I experienced an instance in which an employee disclosed openly to the company what their disability was, and then gave a presentation at a staff meeting to say, hey, if you see me looking at my phone, it's because I use it as a medical device. I'm not trying to be rude. Or, hey, if you see me step away in a way that seems rushed or abrupt, it's not because I'm not giving you my full attention. It's that I need to do this thing to give you my full attention. And that was a way to communicate these behaviors you're seeing that might make it seem like I'm unprofessional, or I'm not fully there. Like, these could be symptoms of my disability, and allowing for education in the workplace of what disabilities mean, that they don't impact performance, the ability to perform well in the workplace, I think offering regular training about disabilities can be really helpful too, to say, hey, if you hear
Absolutely.
so-and-so has autism, like, let's clarify why that person brings something extra to the workplace, so that you treat them the same as everyone else, and listen to their needs and understand that they're a valuable employee with a different perspective. We use the word disability because that may be true, but it doesn't mean that you don't bring something extra, maybe even because of the way that you tend to your invisible disability. You've learned a lot of skills. That's a job too. So I would encourage proactive education to an entire staff about some disabilities that exist and what that can look like and why they bring strengths, and how behaviors may seem. Someone doesn't maintain eye contact, for example. Why is that? It doesn't mean it's not an indication of not paying attention or being evasive. That could be related to disability, and to really give those behaviors the benefit of the doubt if they don't seem consistent with any kind of work performance issue that doesn't need to be addressed by an accommodation.
I love that. Thank you, Laura. I appreciate you bringing that perspective. It's a really good insight. I want to be respectful of our panelists' time here. And I think that if I had to sort of summarize some of the key points that we've learned here today, is that, really in dealing with mental health in the workplace, an open dialogue and a curious mind really go a long way. Approaching, this topic with non-judgment and really just an ethos of working together is going to, 9 times out of 10 guide you to the right solution. I think that both the actionable stuff and the legal insight from Rachel have been really, really helpful. I'd like to give you each a moment to tell our audience how, Rachel, how can folks connect with DLCV? And any shout outs you want to give in terms of, I know you guys have a podcast.
Absolutely. We do have a podcast called Rights Here, Right Now. And you can find our podcast on our website, www.dlcv.org. You can get to the podcast there. You can also call to ask any questions, or if you need any kind of assistance on disability related issues that we may be able to assist with. Many times we are pro bono and we do not charge for services. So you can call us at our local number, which is 804-225-2042, or our 1-800 number, 1-800-552-3962. We have our information and referral specialist available on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays. She fields calls and sends them to our subject matter experts who may be able to answer those questions. Or if you want to submit a request for help online, you can go to www.dlcv.org/gethelp.
Awesome. Well, Rachel, thank you so much for taking the time, lending your expertise to this conversation. I think it's been really valuable.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Shayna, what's the shout out for Dominion Payroll today? What do we want to shine a light on?
Oh man, you know what? I want to shine a light on our employee base, and I'm not just saying that. I think we're just coming out of year end. Our sales team is cranking, our ops team is rolling, and they are working hard on all sides of the building to make Dominion as successful as possible and provide the best service imaginable for our clients. And so I just want to give a shout out to them. I know year end, as always, is a grind, and I feel like people are starting to be able to actually take a breath again, which is great, which is what we're looking for. So, I absolutely love it. We care deeply for our employees and want to make sure they have the best experience, both personally and professionally as possible. And I feel, honored that I get to do that.
100%. I will throw a little bit of a plug that we do have a service called DP Boost, where we do offer some consultative HR practices. So anybody out there in the world who finds it really difficult to unpack some of this information and develop programs for for inside your own house, that may be something where we can lend you a hand. So, always reach out. That's the end of my sales pitch. I rarely try to make this about any products or services that we offer.
Honestly, if you are an organization that doesn't have the ways and means to have a dedicated HR team, Boost is a great alternative to that, so that you can still get those services for your people.
Totally. Well, Rachel, Shayna, and Laura, the in and out Laura, the occasional Laura, we appreciate you all taking the time to be here today. Thanks so much for this conversation. I know that our audience got a lot out of it, so we appreciate it.
Thank you so much. It's been a great conversation.
Thank you so much. We appreciate it.
All right, everybody out there in webinar land, thank you so much for joining us today. I am Kevin Wilson, your host. This has been The Beacon. We appreciate you tuning in. Remember, you can always go to dominionpayroll.com and hit that resource button at the top of the homepage to learn about all of our upcoming webinars and all the resources that we have to help you navigate these challenging times. Looks like there's a light at the end of that tunnel and there's warmer days ahead. So hope everybody has a great Wednesday. Thank you for tuning in. And as always, don't forget to wash your hands. Have a great day, everybody.
Thanks, Kevin. Bye.
Thank you.